Introducing Chomsky by John Maher and Judy book review. So this is part of the Introducing series by Iconic Books, which I don't know if you've seen them in the bookstores. I used to see these books a lot when I lived in Japan. They're English language books, but they'd be in the English language section of the Japanese bookstores. And I saw them when I was in Australia. I believe they're published out of London. I don't remember seeing them back home in the United States, but I may be wrong. They also go by some different names like the Beginners series or the Introducing series. What they are is they're a series of slim paperback books, about 200 pages. And it's not really a book. Well, I mean, it is a book, but it's a graphic novel. Well, it's not really a graphic novel, but it's a comic book with illustrations and then some text accompanying the illustrations, which explain either famous philosophers or famous things about philosophy, or I don't know, various things. There's one on Einstein and one on Karl Marx and one on Hegel. And so it's kind of like philosophy for dummies. So you don't know anything about philosophy, you see this, there's a 200-page comic book on Hegel or Marx or Chomsky or Derrida or something, and you flip through it in the bookstore and you think, well, okay, I'm a complete dummy, I don't know anything about philosophy, but this is a comic book, this will be very easy to read. I actually picked up a couple of these books when I was in Japan. I don't remember which ones now. I think maybe it might have been the one on Karl Marx's theories and maybe one on Hegel. And did not get a lot out of them. But I attributed it at the time to the fact that I didn't put a lot of effort into it. I just kind of flipped through it on the train. I didn't make a serious effort to read it thoroughly from start to finish, even though it was just a comic book. But I saw this again when I was in Melbourne, and I was at the university at the time studying linguistics, studying applied linguistics. So I thought, okay, now would be a perfect time, now that I'm studying it, to get this introduction to Chomsky and just, even though it's a comic book, read it from cover to cover, pay close attention to it, and finally get somewhat of an introduction to Chomsky's theories. Although this was after I had just read The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which is also a pretty good introduction to Chomsky's theories. But The Language Instinct talks about a lot of stuff. Chomsky's universal grammar is in there, but a lot of other stuff is in there as well. So anyways, I got this book. I was hoping it would act as a good primer on Chomsky's theories about universal grammar. And boy, it was not. This was, the thing about these introducing books is they're very eye-catching with their pictures. So you're flipping through it in the bookstore and you're like, oh, it's just a bunch of pictures. It should be very easy to understand. But then you try and read some of the text that accompanies that picture, and it is not easy to understand at all. So here is a typical example. This is from page 15. It's on E-language and I-language. And you're just gonna have to trust me on this. I didn't take it out of context. This is really all they give to explain about E-language and I-language. So, quoting from the book. Chomsky originally developed the notion of competence, which is the system of knowledge that a native speaker possesses. This cognitive system or domain is reformulated rather differently as I-language, a state of the mind-brain. I-language is what a child acquires when it learns language, an instantiation of the initial state. It is highly abstract, remote from ordinary behavior and mechanisms. By contrast, E-language means external, extensional, any concept of language that is not internal to the mind-brain. So, if one refers to Irish as the language they talk where it is dotted orange on a map of Ireland, that's a case of e-language. It bears conceptual resemblance, but no special relation to the earlier term performance, how language is actually used. E-language relates neither to competence nor performance, which are about organisms, nor to complicated socio-political constructs. So, after hearing that, can you explain what the difference between I language and E language is? Because I had no clue what they were talking about. I know I just took that as a random excerpt from the book, but if you were to start at page 1 in the book and try and work your way through like I did, it doesn't make any more sense when you actually get to it. A paragraph like this, because when I'm reading a book, I tend to be rather anal retentive about trying to understand everything before I move on. I read this paragraph several times over. I could not make sense of it, and then I just moved on. And basically, the whole first part of the book is like this. The first 120 pages, which is actually more than half of the book, is talking about Chomsky's language theories. And I just could not make heads or tails of it. The only parts I understood were basically the parts that I had already understood from reading about it in Steven Pinker. Reading about it from this book just didn't make any sense to me. Now, I thought, I'm not the brightest guy. Maybe it's just me. Maybe other people are understanding this book fine. So I went to Amazon, and if you go to the Amazon page for a book, you can read other user reviews. And here are some of the other reviews people left about this book. Quote, I gave up trying 1/3 into the book. Not only are the technical terms not defined, but any attempt to derive their meaning or establish relationships between concepts failed. Much of the argument is enigmatic rather than explanatory. Many utterances seem to be drawn out of context. And here's somebody else. Quote, I could not recommend it to a non-linguist who wanted an introduction to Chomsky's thought. There's simply too much use of technical terms without defining them, mixing of difficult technical concepts, etc. And here's another guy. Quote, utterly fails to make it understandable for beginners. I found myself drowning in a subject I didn't particularly want to read about anyway. And here's another guy, quote, this book might make sense for somebody already well familiar with Chomsky's ideas, but it didn't help me much. I just gave up on this one as not the place to start. And another guy, quote, this book didn't explain all the technical terms too well or at all. I finished the book with hardly anything learned about linguistics. And another guy, quote, for almost the entire book, it's about Chomsky on linguistics, which, by the way, made no sense at all. I raised my voice because he put that in all capital letters, followed by several exclamation marks. It was just so confusing, which was the whole point of making an introduction in the first place. I think he means to say the whole point of making an introduction in the first place was so it wouldn't be confusing. Those are a series of other quotes from other people's reviews about this book on Amazon. Perhaps you're beginning to see a pattern in the frustrations people have about this book. Now, I think the problem was, in part, that the author of this book, Maher, is locked into this format where he's got to use the pictures. So each page is taken up by illustrations, and he's only got like a tiny amount to explain. And it seems at first that if you want to make something easy to understand, you use a bunch of pictures, right? If you want to make an introduction, make it into a comic book, it'll make it easy for everyone to understand. But actually, for some topics, a comic book is the worst way to explain it. Because in order to make this actually make sense, to be comprehensible to somebody who's not an expert in the field, you need to give them a lot of background knowledge, and you need to explain all these concepts that linguists just assume. In other words, you need a book like this, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which, as you can see, it's not a comic book, and it's not a particularly short book, but it very carefully explains all the theories, well, not all, but a lot of Chomsky's theories of grammar to somebody who has no background in linguistics, and he needs a lot of words in order to do that. John Maher just has a few words on each page. That, or I don't know, either that or he just didn't care. The guy, looking up his bio, he's an Irish linguist who teaches linguistics at the University of Tokyo, and maybe he just can't be bothered to explain this to a non-specialist audience. I don't know. One or the other. I hate to be too hard on the guy, because you do get the sense reading the book that he is a genuine admirer of Chomsky. But yeah, he just utterly failed at making any sense of Chomsky's linguistic arguments to a non-specialist audience. So the linguistic stuff is about 120 pages. I really did my best with this one. I struggled through it as best I could. I'm not really sure I learned anything from it. I don't know, maybe one or two things I learned from it. Then the next 50 pages, the last 50 pages, are about Chomsky's politics, Chomsky's political theories. And then here, all of a sudden, it gets much easier to understand. Now, Chomsky, it's really hard to sum him up succinctly, because he's a walking encyclopedia on every political event of the last 100 years. But some of Chomsky's more notable thoughts are introduced. His opinions on Indonesia, Nicaragua, Vietnam. Sorry, the Indonesia, I think he was referring to Suharto's coup in Indonesia and the United States' involvement of it. Nicaragua, meaning the Contras and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and America's involvement in that. And then Vietnam, the war in Vietnam. The book also does a nice job of firmly grounding Chomsky in the anarchist tradition. At the time I was reading this book, I was attending some meetings by various political groups at the University of Melbourne, and I was encountering some Trotskyist groups who were trying to convince me that Chomsky was actually a socialist in the Trotskyist line. And I kept saying, no, 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 he's an anarchist, he's an anarchist. And so at that time it was very nice to read this book, which very firmly puts Chomsky in the anarchist tradition. So the political part of this book is actually all right as far as it goes. It's only the last 50 pages of the book. But on the other hand, Chomsky's politics don't really need an introduction. I mean, you can just go to YouTube and watch any of Chomsky's interviews or any of his lectures. When he talks about politics, he talks about it in ways that are very easy for everyone to understand. You don't need an introducing Chomsky's politics. You just go to YouTube and watch Chomsky speak about politics himself. What you do need is somebody to introduce Chomsky's linguistic theories, because those are very difficult to understand for somebody who doesn't have a background in linguistics. And that's where this book completely failed. But at the risk of repeating myself, If you want a good introduction to Chomsky's linguistics theories, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. This is a good introduction to Chomsky's linguistics theories. Introducing Chomsky by John Maher and Judy Groves is not.